Hi, I'm Nicole, and today we're going to be talking about being worthy of new beginnings. You see, new beginnings can take many forms. They can mean that maybe an area you're walking down you shouldn't have been walking down, and God wants to kind of turn you around and have you go a different direction. But not necessarily is that always true. Sometimes God just opens doors and said, hey, we've been going down this road for a while, and guess what? We've got a new start. We're going over here, and I've got something new and fresh for you. You see, I went to college in the same town I grew up in. I knew everybody. I had lived there my entire life, and I had plans to pretty much never leave until I was in college and started dating a guy who lived in Jacksonville, Florida, and I lived in Indiana. And so we did long distance for several years and really thinking that this was the guy. And we had made plans that my senior year of college, when I graduated in May, I was going to move to Jacksonville, Florida, and that's where I would follow my career. And things didn't go as planned. And after dating for several years, and he broke up with me. And then shortly after, started dating a good friend of his. And it was so heartbreaking, like devastating. And I remember months and months of just really leaning so closely into the Lord because that's all I really had. And just my Bible was like all written up. I was hearing his voice. I mean, he was so audible during that time, during that season when I was so desperate for him. And I remember him continually saying, Nikki, you're still supposed to move to Jacksonville, Florida. And thinking like, no, like I'll do anything, Lord, but I'm still healing. Like you want me to go back there where everybody's going to think that I'm chasing after him. I can't do that. Like give me something else. I can't do that. And he just wouldn't stop talking to me about it. I remember the day when I was in January and I finally was like, fine, I'll move. I mean, I totally said it, I believe, just to like get him off my back. But the next minute was something I never expected. I had this crazy peace just like swarm over my body. And I sat there and I just cried because I knew I had to. I knew I had to move. And I remember 5 months later, after graduating from college, my parents driving away as they had unpacked me in my Jacksonville, Florida apartment and just weeping again. I remember going to work at this new job and hating every second. I remember people thinking what I thought they would think, and can't blame them, that I had chased after a guy. And the couple friends that I did have left at the end being so precious to me. It was a really hard season of my life. But during that 6 months, a church that I had worked with when I lived in Indiana found out that I was only living 3 hours from them. They were in Orlando. And one weekend, they invited me to come down and check out an outreach youth facility they were opening. That was kind of my experience back in Indiana, was working with outreach youth centers. And I walked into this building that was still under construction. And I remember them saying, we've been praying, and we feel like you're supposed to be the director of this program. Would you be interested in taking the job? And I'm thinking, oh, Lord, that's what you've been doing. You see, 6 months of such horrible experience, and I don't want to downplay that because there were some precious people in my life during that time, but a lot of tears during that 6 months. God was opening doors, a new beginning on both sides to have me work in Orlando. I would have never taken this job if I wouldn't have ever left Indiana. I would have gotten comfortable, right? 4 years I was able to invest in youth. I had such a huge impact in lives there, and God just, I was able to be his hands and his feet. My sister moved down with me. She met her husband, who's an amazing man, and I can just see God's hand over all of it. But part of it was just saying yes, even though it was the last thing that I possibly wanted to do. You see, we're going to stop in with Hagar again. We've talked about the first part of her story on one of our other teachings, and we talked about how she was a servant of Sarah. Sarah couldn't conceive children, and God had promised them children, but Sarah took God's promise into her own hands and sent her servant Hagar in to sleep with her husband Abraham, and Hagar got pregnant. And Sarah deals harshly with Hagar, and Hagar goes running. God meets her in the wilderness, and God says that she's going to have a boy. She should name him Ishmael, that he's going to have so many descendants, and that he is going to be a free man, and that she needs to go back to Sarah. And Hagar does. And probably for the next 13 years, she probably lived a pretty cush life, because she may still be a servant, but she is also raising Ishmael, which is the son of Abraham, who's over the entire clan of people. So her she probably was living pretty comfortably. She wasn't probably serving and slaving much anymore. And it's interesting because we kind of fast forward in Genesis 21 and we get the second part of Hagar's story. And here Sarah conceives son Isaac, just as God had promised. And Isaac is having a weaning party, and Ishmael is 13. So this is 13 years later. And it says that Ishmael was teasing Isaac. Now, Ishmael's 13. If you've ever been around a 13-year-old boy, they love to tease. So it could have been very harmless, but Sarah gets very upset about it. And she goes to Abraham and says, I want them sent off. I want Hagar and Ishmael out of here. And Abraham is having a little hard time with it, but God gives him a peace. So he sends them off with some water and food, and they go walking through the wilderness. Now, interesting enough, Hagar, the water starts running dry, and Hagar is pretty sure that they're going to die in the desert. She has forgotten all about all the promises that God has made to her, and even the promises he's already fulfilled to her. And instead, she puts her son under a bush, walks a whole football field away from him because she does not want to see him die. I find this so interesting because 13 years earlier, her problem was when Sarah dealt harshly with her was to run. She ran in the wilderness and God came after her. Can I just tell you, a lot of times, a lot of our problems that we have, that we deal with, they're not dealt with when we're comfortable and cozy, because 13 years later, here's Hagar. She's got the same tendency. When the going gets tough, Hagar gets going. She's a runner. That's what she does best. And she's still doing it even after she already had an encounter with the Lord. Sometimes trials and hardships come our way because God says, hey, they kind of reveal those fault lines. And he's like, you need my touch right there. Like, I'm going to allow this to happen to you because you're going to be uncomfortable, but it's because you need my touch and you need to be aware that this is an issue that we have, but let's fix it. And so here, when she's cozy and comfortable, it's not dealt with, and we see that it's still active in her life. Another thing that I'm so thankful for is that Jesus didn't say, hey, I came to you 13 years prior, like physical encounter, talking to you. And here we are 13 years later, and you just think I'm going to let you die? Like, I promised that you'd have a son and that you'd name him Ishmael, and you did. And I promised you that he'd be free. And what didn't you just get set free? Like, why would you think that I would leave you? Because I also promised you in that same thing that your descendants would be numerous. Why would I not? Why would I fulfill all the promises, but not that one? And I'm so thankful that God just didn't throw up our hands with her and be like, I can't help you. I tried to tell you, right? He never acts skittish around our mess, right? Like, he is totally okay coming after her again. And this is what he does when she's a whole football field away from her son. He said, it says, but God heard the boy crying. This is Ishmael. And the angel of the Lord called to Hagar from heaven. Hagar, what's wrong? Well, I think it's funny that he asked that question, but do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Go to him and comfort him, for I will make a great nation from his descendants. See, there's always an action required of us to unveil the next step of God's plan. He says, go to him. In other words, she loved her son. That's why she didn't want to watch him die. And so you can guarantee that he probably had way more water than she did. She was probably very dehydrated, but God said, hey, you have to walk back over to him and you have to comfort him. You have to say those things like, God's got this. And I believe that God's going to come through for us. And guess what? She does. She follows through with the action and she goes back. And after she comforts her son, God reveals to her a spring of water. All of God's promises came through. In fact, the Arab nation actually comes from Ishmael. And so his descendants are too numerous to even count today. It's kind of crazy the way that all of God's promises came through. Now, maybe she didn't get like an A+ on her new beginning, but I would love to imagine that maybe she learned a lesson. There's a scene in Runaway Bride where Julia Roberts hands her shoes into Richard Gere, and she hands him a shoebox, and he opens it up and he sees these beat up pair of running shoes and he says, they're used. And she says, yeah, they're mine. And he says, this is serious. And I would love to say that Hagar maybe had that experience with God. That maybe for once she turned in her running shoes to him and she was like, I get it. Like, you really do have this. And I don't need to run. In fact, maybe I should run to you next time instead of away from the problem. You see, when we talk about new beginnings, we have to realize that saying yes does not mean that it's going to be easy. That by saying, okay, God, I'm going to walk through that door, doesn't mean that we're going to be met with fields of flowers. Man, when I said yes to the Lord, I really thought that life would be a little bit different in Jacksonville than what it was going to be. But I wouldn't trade those 6 months for anything, because during those 6 months, God really showed me a lot of areas in my life that needed some correction, those little fault lines that needed His touch. And I had several moments where I was turning in some of those running shoes analogies, right? Where I was saying, Lord, I'm so sorry. Let me get better at this. You see, new beginnings are all about moving forward. They're about allowing Him to open up new doors and walking through them. Sometimes when you don't even think you have it in you, He will come after you, because He will always fight for you for your new beginnings, just like He did for Hagar.